It is such an honor to be here today. And I was thinking earlier today when I came in before the first service, I get an opportunity frequently now to speak on the floor of the U.S. House. And every time I go in there, the hair stands up on the back of my neck because of just the history and the heritage. And I do believe there's divine inspiration that went into that, and I'll share that here in just a minute. But coming into a house of worship is yet another level. This is where we worship the living God. And I just want you to know I don't take that for granted. And for Pastor Paul to allow me to do this is just a real honor for me. And in terms of the timing, there's, of course, no way that any of us could have known what would happen with David and the Moreland family. But I'm very sensitive to that. I want to just share with you that please understand that there is nothing about being a member of the United States Congress that gives me the qualifications to minister. There won't be a sermon today. I can't do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the best I can to try to share a perspective of a Christian believing member of Congress and a vantage point for that. But I'm not equipped for that compassionate message that probably would be very appropriate right now. And I know that that Pastor Paul is going to embrace that when he's able to. But I'm going to shift gears here in just a second, and we're going to be talking about government and a perspective there. Just know that I am sensitive to what's happened with the church family, and there's certainly no disrespect at all by the direction that I take here today. So thank you. And let's start with a word of Scripture. If you would, please, go with me to 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. And in that Scripture it says, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king is supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for punishment, or evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king." Government is ordained by God. That's part of his plan, part of his structure. And that's really important. But the story doesn't end there. Go with me now to Acts 4, 18 through 20. And just as a setup for this scripture, you remember the story. John and Peter had been blessed. They had been given the ability to do miracles on God's behalf. And they were doing that in Israel, and the government at the time was the Sanhedrin, and they were jealous. And they were seeing that the people were following John and Peter. And they don't like that. And so they're trying to shut them down. So that was a setup for this scripture, Acts 4, 18 through 20. So they called them and commanded them not to speak at all, nor teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard." There's man's law, and there's God's law. And those are things that we have to embrace. We are to honor man's law. But under those circumstances where there is a conflict, we're Christians first. As we move forward to the next phase of the conversation here, I would point out that if the founders of this nation would have only followed man's law, there would be no United States of America. Now, that's not an encouragement to go out and break man's law. All I'm trying to do is leave a perspective here, okay? There is no doubt that the United States of America was founded as a Christian nation. Our founding documents align very well with Scripture. If you've heard of the American Patriot Bible, I don't have one today because, frankly, I've given them all away. I buy these things by the case. It's a New King James version of the Bible. But there's commentary in the front and the back. I might see one. No, I don't. I thought I might be seeing one. Okay. But the commentary, among other things, will make the connection between the various sections of the Constitution with the biblical principle that back it up. And so if anyone doubts that our founding documents, and particularly the U.S. Constitution, is not divinely inspired, give them one of those, because you can't refute it once you take a look at those facts. And frankly, I believe that divine inspiration is the reason why, over the last couple 100+ years, that the USA has been the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. Did you know that the United States of America has created more prosperity than every other nation in the history of the world combined? That's not by accident. And we are the most powerful nation in the world today. As we'll talk about here in a minute, I fear sometimes that we're trying to forfeit that, and I do mean forfeit. It's not being taken away. There is a threat of that being forfeited. But today, we are the most powerful nation in the world. The founders of this nation were not perfect. If you're a student of history and you look back at the actions that led up to the Revolutionary War, you'll see that they were just so much like the rest of us. They had struggles. They had human problems. And I know that sometimes in history they're looked upon as being these larger than life. Now it's more common to tear them down. But the bottom line was they were humans just like us. And I thought it might be interesting at least to share a perspective of what could be some similarities and some differences from those founding political leaders to our political leaders of today. And the first one is, I think we are similar in that there was definitely some common struggles. Physical problems, anger problems, family issues, alcoholism. I mean, go down the line. The same thing going on in the U.S. Congress today was happening back in the 1700s. They were humans. They had the same struggles. As I was preparing some thoughts for this, something else came upon me as I was doing just a little bit of homework on that history and comparing it to today. Another point that I would say where they're similar is there tends to be a lot of wealth, a lot of personal wealth. For the era in the 1700s, those who and there's exceptions, but those who were involved on the front end had considerable wealth for their day. And that's probably not by accident, because they were workers, they were performers, they had businesses, farms, ranches. They were out working, they were creating that wealth. There's a lot of wealth in the U.S. Congress today, possibly for some of those same reasons. There's a few exceptions to that. But I would also indicate that there's at least one other reason that is significantly different. Today, it takes a tremendous amount of resources to obtain a seat. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But we just finished a campaign cycle, and I've got colleagues that I serve with every day who spent anywhere from $10 to $50 million for a campaign on a 2-year congressional term. Some of the Senate ones, because it's a 6-year term, have exceeded $100 million for a campaign. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but how the situation has evolved, it's just made it very, very difficult, very competitive. And frankly, a lot of that by a lot of people gets contributed on the front end. Most people have no idea what it's like to do a statewide or a district-wide political campaign and the resource that it takes. In my case, it's a little bit different because I've got a little bit of history. And a number of you I met for the first time probably in 2014. Don and John of Bradway right here, front and center, are one of them. And I was in the governor's race at that point and wound up being the runner-up, which was probably a blessing in disguise. But we built friendships. We built a network. We built those relationships. And frankly, that's one of the biggest blessings about doing this job. If it weren't for what I do, there was no way I would have an opportunity to talk to you today. There'd be no way that I get a chance to meet so many people personally. That is a lifelong gift. And whenever this phase of life is over, we're still going to be friends. And that's a blessing. There's drawbacks too, but to be honest, that's a real big one, a real blessing. So there's also some differences, I think, in the eras that I wanted to just point out as an observation. Up until very recently, I could interact with colleagues that I serve with, and I could put them in 2 categories. One would be you've got those who are there for all the right reasons. They want to do the right thing. They have a passion for the constitutional law or constitutional principles, or there's certain issues they feel very, very strongly about. They want to make the country a stronger place, and they're there to do the right thing. And you can tell. And there's a lot of them. There really are. There's a lot of really good people that I serve with. The other one is a little bit different. There are those who are, there's some kind of a status deal or maybe a perceived power driver for them. And maybe not for all the right reasons are they there. Those are the ones that bother me. But again, you can figure that out pretty quick. When you get in these one-on-one scenarios and these discussions behind the closed doors and the debate starts kicking in and the hard votes start showing up, you can tell who wavers and who doesn't. There is a third category that I'm going to get to here in just a minute that I think is relatively new, but let's compare and contrast that to the 1700s. I don't think those categories really existed then. They had everything to lose. They weren't there for any status or power. They were rebelling against the system. The other thing about them, I believe, was although they had the same flaws that we do, the same struggles that we do, I think their faith went deeper. They had a common bond, and it was the liberty bond, the freedom bond. They had that bond, and I think it's clear as you go back and you start peeling back the layers of the onions of history, it was their faith that gave them the drive and that gave them that cause, that common bond to just succeed at all costs. That doesn't necessarily exist today. And I have a theory as to part of the reason. I think part of it is we have it relatively well today. And it's been quite a while since we haven't had a pretty good system. I think we have been victims of our success to some extent because our safety, sometimes we take for granted. Our quality of life, the fact that there's usually something in the fridge, and if not, there's usually something on the shelf at the grocery store that we have the means to go purchase. And I think sometimes that we've been victims of our own success on that front, and we've lost maybe just a little bit of touch as to how things really work and where prosperity really comes from, where wealth really comes from. They didn't have that then because it was very commonplace, much more commonplace, I think, even today than the poverty level. Excuse me. By the way, history correctly identifies our founders. And you've all heard the names, Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, and those are all relatively famous, accurate names. But what history may not appropriately identify correctly is all the right first names. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look back at the founding of the nation and how it all sequentially played out, we have solid records of meetings that start in about 1737, planning this in a very organized way. George, Thomas, Ben, and so on, either were not born yet or were very, very young. The point being is, it was their parents. We all know George, Thomas, Ben, but we don't know Augustine and Peter and Josiah and Mary. They raised their kids in the way they should go. They trained those kids their priorities. They weren't in a position to execute on the path to free a nation, to start a nation, but their children were. And when they had the opportunity, they took it. And they executed on it. Go with me to Proverbs 22:6. Famous verse, short verse. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when old, he will not depart from it. Pertinent, I believe, because we've got to do a better job educating our kids. That is a major issue for us today. We are teaching our children, in many cases, that America is somehow bad, that this was an opportunistic nation and the roots are bad. If you're under 30 through the public school system, there is a probability that somewhere along the line you were taught that, no, the U.S. economy was solely built on the backs of the slave trade, or that America has simply just used what power it's gleaned by extorting worldwide labor and using that for fiscal gain. Hey, we're not perfect, but I want to just put on the table to consider this. America is the only nation to fight a war for the primary purpose of ending slavery. And it cost 683,000 lives to do it. No other nation's done that. The United States of America is the main, or the primary factor in fighting 2 world wars for the purpose of freeing the rest of the world from tyrants. 500,000, plus minus, 500,000 people died in that effort. This whole constitutional moniker of separation of church and state, it's been so misapplied. The purpose for that, and I'm sure Pastor Paul has talked about this a number of times, the purpose for that was to keep the state out of the church, not the church out of the state. And we continue to misapply that. America is not perfect. We've got flaws, and I know that right now that a number of them are popping up in your minds, and I can assure you, I can add to the list, whatever list you come up with. But America is good. Sometimes in this job, I've learned things that I'd just rather not know. I look at the intelligence reports. I look at the Homeland Security updates. If it wasn't for the United States of America, much of the rest of this planet would be in turmoil, or more turmoil than it is. We are the stabilizing force. And I can assure you, there is a lot of bad guys that would like to take us down. Ironically, our biggest threat is within. But we are the stabilizing force on this planet. America is good. That kind of brings me back to the discussion where we were comparing and contrasting leaderships of the eras. I believe there's a new third category, if you will, of leader. And for the most part, they took office the same time I did, about 2 years ago. And those are the ones who they want a revolution too. But they want to create the revolution and engage and overhaul structural change towards a socialistic model. They're currently part of the Democrat Party by name, and by the way, that's not a slam on the Democrat Party. I'm a Republican, full disclosure. There's my bias. However, I work with everybody that I can. And things have changed. I had grandparents that were staunch Democrats. I had grandparents that were staunch Republicans. I remember as a kid their discussions all the time. The main arguing points was whether or not FDR's programs were good or bad. They were all pro-life. They were all pro-Second Amendment. That is a far cry from where it is today. And I would argue probably on both sides. But in this particular case, that new third type of leader, if you will, they don't want to be called, they certainly don't want to be called Republicans. They don't want to be called Democrats either. They want to be called socialist progressives. And we were talking at the break, and I'm not going to go into names. You can probably figure out some of them. But someone asked me, is it just because they're stupid? And I would tell you, no, because they're not. But what I would say is there is a tremendous lack of understanding of perspective on history and what makes this world go around. There's one in particular that their entire life is centered around the 5 boroughs of New York. And that's it. When they measure distance, it's in terms of subway stops. Never really outside in the rest of the country, certainly outside the nation. That's not a criticism other than the lack of understanding or the lack of respect for how the rest of the world really operates. Folks, sometimes you do need to go through the process of signing the front side of a paycheck or understanding how commerce works, generating jobs, going through it. There's nothing that prepares you for life like having to go through and work it yourself. You appreciate it when you work for it. You appreciate it when you come through that. And so much of the time, I think we've had it so good that we don't really fully understand and respect what we've got. Another interesting data point on that front. A lot of the election results in southern Florida in particular was a huge shift from where it was 4 years ago. And I know a lot of them. Mario Diaz-Balart is a good friend of mine. He's a congressman from Miami. His family are Cuban refugees. When the whole socialist moniker comes up, they go, no, 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 no. We're not going there. We've been there, done that. We're not doing it again. Immigrants from Venezuela. If you want to get a real understanding of how that works, talk to some of those folks. So that's that new third category. And they're being aided. Well, I'll back up and say one other story. When we vote in the U.S. House, your name goes on the big board, and whether you an I or an A pops up next to your name. And there are some that people watch. You know, if someone is a real expert on a certain subject matter, you're watching, okay, how did so-and-so vote, because that might influence how they vote. I don't think these people get watched a lot from that standpoint. I don't think they have a tremendous amount of influence when it comes to the workings inside that chamber or the influence there. Where they have it is when they step off the floor. There is a row as long as the eye can see with cameras and microphones, because the media loves it. They can't get enough of it, and they broadcast that. Go to Isaiah 5:20. Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Folks, that is a lot. Not all. That's a lot of our media right now. And that's where so much of that influence comes from. And this is advice. I won't tell you that it's necessarily good. It's free. Do with it what you will. But shut off ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, okay? Shut them off. Try One American News. Try Newsmax. If you like the printed news, try Epic Times. Try Wall Street Journal is still reasonable. I mean, they'll go both ways, but it's a data point. But this news media is a big deal, and probably when I'm out and traveling around, that's one of the things I get the most. Where do you get your information? So, even as an office, what we're starting to do is when issues come up, we get information from staff. It's from hired people that are employed to dig up the data and the committee actions and how that's executed. And for the most part, they have to get it right or they get fired. So that's where a lot of our information comes from. So we're starting to do more and more posting on the congressional website, just on the issues in a brief explanation of what's going on to the best of our understanding. If that can be a resource for you, please access it. We'll try to get better. We're not really good at it yet, but we're getting better at it. So that was free of charge. The other force, if you will, that is assisting in that effort, whether directly or indirectly, to push towards a socialist model is the establishment itself, or call it the deep state, call it the swamp, call it the status quo, whatever. But I would like to explain that just a little bit, maybe with a story. So, about 6 months after taking office, this is all pre-COVID, I could tell there was a tremendous amount of conflict. It just shouldn't have to be that way. You know, within other members and the speaker and the Senate leaders. And I asked for a meeting with two of the old sages there. One is Don Young. He's a congressman from Alaska. He's been in office since 1972. He was present, the only one still there, either side, that was present when Richard Nixon resigned as a member. And then Bob Latta. Bob, you may not have heard of, but he's from Ohio, and he literally grew up in office. His father was in the seat from 1959, 1989. He picked it up then. He literally grew up there. And his entire office is nothing but congressional history. But I said, gentlemen, is it just me, or is there an inordinate amount of conflict here? And these are their words, not mine. I said, Russ, there is more conflict, we believe, in the United States Congress today than at any time since the Civil War. And then Don took it a step further and said, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think that is. And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out this thing and he says, instantaneous news, number 1. Back to the previous conversation. And not just instantaneous news, but news editorialized. And he said, you'll never have a vote, a debate, a committee meeting, a hearing, where by the time you're out the door, there's not a post, there's not a broadcast, there's not some kind of a media excerpt, usually with a spin on it that you need to overcome. So literally, you start by having to reset the truth on a lot of these. And I've seen it. I'll come out of a hearing and I'll see what got printed or got broadcast and go, were you in the same place that I was? So that's the first thing. The second thing he said was the speaker today, Speaker of the House, has changed how Congress functions. Specifically, how normally it functions. Same thing in the state legislature, by the way. The germane committee chairs set the agenda for that content. So if you're the chairman of transportation, you set the agenda for that. If you're the chairman of health and welfare, you set the agenda for that. When this speaker came in, she says, no, I'm going to set the agenda for everything. Now, why the chairman allow that, I really don't know, because collectively and procedurally, they could run right over the top of her, but they don't. So one person is the gateway for the entire agenda for the U.S. House. I have met with her. I myself, and I'm not just me, I've got many pieces of legislation. Many of them have Democrat co-sponsors. And in an attempt to try to get some of those things heard, a lot of them are Western-related issues that really aren't political in nature with, the parties. It's just stuff that I think needs to happen. And I'll give her an A for honesty and an A for effectiveness, because she'll say, Russ, listen, just understand, while I'm the speaker, the main agenda here is going to be to turn over this administration, because I think that's the best thing that can happen. And she has held true to that. So that's part of the dynamic. That was Don's number 2. He says, number 3, airplanes. He said, most people, myself included, most people go home on the weekends. We used to play, he'll say, we used to play in the Congressional Softball League. We used to take our spouses to dinner. We used to get to know one another. Friends, I'll tell you, it's difficult to get to know one another. I set out, like a number of members in the first 18 months, to try to meet every single member, get some kind of a personal rapport, personal relationship. And I was able to do that in my own party, and to some extent, across the aisle. But then you just start hitting roadblocks where, no, I will not have a conversation with you. I will not even for that meeting. And it's been magnified, of course, with COVID, right, and all this reasons that Congress shouldn't be back in D.C., which is another bunch of bunk. Congress didn't have a problem meeting during the Civil War or during a couple of world wars or a couple of previous pandemics. We should be there all the time now, not voting by proxy. And so in my opinion, that's a whole other story. I could go for an hour on just that. But that, I believe, is being politicized to the point where it keeps Congress out of D.C. It cuts down the debate when we should be debating more. Enough of that. I want to share with you a theory educated theory of the real root of conflict today between President Trump and everybody else, I guess. Over the decades, the federal government has gotten so big, the agencies so large, the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, FBI, has gotten so large, they have become living, breathing beings. And so every department head, every supervisor is incentivized to keep that department going, growing, raises for people, and so their own network, their own system gets put into place. And in many cases, there's not the accountability that should really be there. People like me, people like Donald Trump, many other members, we come and we go. To them, we're transients. We're in and out in a few years. They're there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. If a bad member of Congress or a bad president comes in, they just slow roll the whole process and we'll outlive this person. Well, 2016, President Trump comes in. He's a business guy. He sees what I've been trying to verbalize here. He says, well, okay, I'm going to fire you. I'm going to fire you. I'm going to shrink this group. I'm going to do that. What happens when a parasite is threatened with losing its host? They do extraordinary things to try to keep that going. Now, that's not a criticism of all of it, because there's a lot of it that's good. But all of us need accountability. Amen. All of us need a good cleaning up every now and then. Amen. But that turned the entire city on its ear. That is where impeachment charges come from. That's where collusion, corroboration, misinformation, tax abuse, whatever, that's where that came from. Folks, I have read this stuff. I may not be the sharpest knife in a drawer, but I can read and I can understand what I read. There was Russian collusion, but it wasn't the president. There was a lot of these charges that have come out. They're true. They're accurate charges. Just the wrong target. So, I believe that's where the root of this is, and I'm going to share one last thing on this to drive home a point. When 9/11 happened, all of us probably remember where we were. I was not in office. I wasn't involved with government at all at that stage. But when that happened, a wholesale change was made in Washington. The Department of Homeland Security was founded. There was this piece of legislation called the Patriot Act. Now, this is a world according to Russ, okay? This is a theory, but I'm living it. Here's what I believe happened. That gave a tremendous amount of open field running without accountability to the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, FBI, Secret Service. I have personally been in hearings where we will have those people in front of us and we'll be asking them questions and they'll say, we can't answer that. Well, yes, you can. We're the oversight body. We're the legislative oversight. Nope, can't share it. Well, if we need to go to the secure room, let's do that. Nope, can't do that either. Somewhere along the line, we have the ability to subpoena people. We do that. I do that. But if they resist, somewhere along the line, congressional subpoena authority got turned over to the Department of Justice, which is the executive branch. I still haven't figured that out yet. But if somebody resists a congressional subpoena, then you got to go to the Department of Justice to get it enforced. Sometimes they'll do it, sometimes they won't. If you remember the IRS scandals and Secretary Holder and whatnot, the evidence says they were guilty as heck. but they never got called in for it because there wasn't a subpoena. That lack of accountability and the fact that someone is now challenging it from the president's office has created this clash. I don't know what is going to come out of this election. I'm as close as most, maybe not everybody, but I am involved with it. It's not over. Know that. There is fraud. Know that. Know that to some extent there's fraud in every election, but I personally have evidence that's been delivered to me, so I know there is. The question is there enough to sway the presidential outcome, and can it be proven before the states certify? And there's another hour worth of discussion. But that is unfolding as we speak. But please know this too. No matter what happens there, on balance, the rest of this election cycle, if you tend to be a mindset of a conservative Christian, you're going to like most of, at least the trends that have transpired. We made gains in the U.S. House, some significant gains. In our state, we made gains. In the largest populous county of our state, we made significant gains. Pray for Georgia. If you're of that mindset, that January 5 is a big, big day because that's going to dictate who controls the Senate. But as a perspective on that, I wanted to share just another story before my time runs out. I got invited to the White House Christmas party last year. Again, we're talking pre-COVID stuff, and I'm not a real partying kind of guy, but I wasn't going to say no to that invite. And I went to that, and I was with Senator Risch. And when we did have an opportunity to speak with the president and the first lady, and I've met the president a number of times. We're not buds. We don't hang out. We're not pals, okay? But enough interaction, one-on-one, small groups, to at least, I think, get a feel for who he is and have a personal contact that I have not utilized, but if I did, I know I could have him in 10 minutes because that's kind of who he is. But we were there, and we had a chance to talk a little bit, and Jim was talking to the president, and I wanted to come up with something that I thought maybe would just be a little encouraging to the First Lady, because so much of the time, especially in those settings, she's expected to be there, but, just be there. And so I said, Melania, I just want to encourage you. I said, I think you're here for the right reasons at the right time. I think God has anointed you with all the personal tools and characteristics that it takes to be in this situation. And I said, it cannot possibly be easy being a wife, a first lady, and a mother in the White House. And when I said the word mother, the eyes well up. And because he's sitting right here, the president heard that and could tell there was a awkward pause, and I'm thinking, what the heck did I do? And he put his hand on her knee and says, it's hard being a mom when you're raising a 14-year-old boy in a cage. There's a cost. And you know what? It's a life sentence if you think about it. The security that, unfortunately, that family needs. You just can't possibly fathom it. And that's going to stick. That's going to have to stick around. And it does follow former presidents as well, for good reason. They've been exposed to information that is very, very sensitive, and much more so than members of Congress do. It even follows us to some extent. But It's a lifelong commitment. And what do you do if you're a 14-year-old boy or you're a mom of a 14-year-old boy and you're trying to give him some kind of normalcy? So I share that with you maybe just to apply a little bit of perspective here. Would that ease if he wasn't the president? Yes. Is it still there? Yeah. But there's still a significant cost that many people don't really affiliate with doing some of these jobs. I think it's just really important, and we should be thankful for those who are willing to do it. He doesn't have to do this. And frankly, a lot of members on both houses, we don't have to do this. But hopefully we're motivated by the right things. Aside from those things, I had talked about the positiveness of this election. I want to share some other positive things with you that no matter what have transpired over the last 4 years. U.S. energy exports has increased by 100%. That has changed the entire economic dynamic for the planet and put us in a much, much stronger position. Our military has been refinanced. We have 3 new Supreme Court judges. We have 195 and counting new federal judges. We've got a border security situation that's better. We've got a NAFTA negotiation that's been renegotiated. We've got a China trade situation that's been addressed. There's another hour if you ever want to talk about that. There's some bad juju coming from over there, folks. Jerusalem is recognized as the capital of Israel. And that stuff is not just easy to reverse, no matter what happens, okay? So, as you go down your prayer list, add to Georgia, put the Trump family on there too. You know, I mean, you don't have to be a Trump fan, but do realize that this is extraordinary, and what they're going through is also extraordinary. The best definition of this thing called politics, which is what I currently do. It's not been my life, and it's not going to be my life forever, but it's what I do right now. The best definition that I've been able to come up with for that is it's a struggle for influence. It's a struggle. And it never ends. Unlike many events or efforts, there's a goal line for that. But not this. It was a struggle in 1776. It was a struggle in the Civil War. It was a struggle during the Spanish flu, the World Wars. It's a struggle today, and it will be a struggle for our kids and our grandkids. And it's going to ebb and it's going to flow, depending on who is willing to engage. So, to fellow believers, I implore you, please stay engaged, because that void is going to be filled. Somebody's going to fill it. But it's an ongoing struggle. And we are, as believers, we are to occupy until he comes. There's also another struggle that we go through, and it's this thing called life. I didn't know David. I don't know his family. But I can see the gut punch, and I'm so sorry. And I don't have the words. There's sometimes you just can't explain stuff. But that's a different kind of struggle. And not as your congressman, but as somebody who shares your faith. When it comes to that, I would encourage you to stop struggling. Turn that part over to Christ. Paul would have to give you best counsel on exactly how to do that, because that's his job. And I think he will, and I think he has. But that's a different kind of struggle. I'm gonna totally go off script here, because I've been able to manage my time a little bit better, and I'm going to share something that I didn't in the first service that I very rarely do. Ironically, one of the few times I've shared this was here a few years ago to the men's Bible study. But in 1995, my wife and I were expecting our third child, and our first and our second, we had a daughter and a son, and then she was pregnant the third time, and the first two pregnancies were textbook. Everything went exactly how it was supposed to, the timing, all of it. And at that time, I was an international business guy. I was traveling all over the world, and I'm very sensitive to being much closer to home during a pregnancy. And this is where the non-manly side of me comes out. But I always had this goofy habit. I would talk to her tummy. Every day. She's about between 6 and 7 months along, and we're going to bed for the evening. And she says, something isn't right. I really think we should go to the hospital. I said, okay. So we went to the hospital, and I thought, okay, this is going to be something routine. And we went into the emergency room, and the nurse came in and was checking my wife, and it was just the three of us, one nurse, myself, and my wife. And I just remember she lifted her head up, and she says 3 words: baby, not happy. And she bolted. And it's seemingly in a nonstop flurry. My wife was on a gurney into the emergency surgery room, and the doors didn't seem to stop swinging by the time another nurse ran out with this little blue baby running for the ICU. They did an emergency C-section. Hindsight, we learned that the placenta had detached. And so for a period of time, there wasn't any air. And the physician came out, he talked to me, he said, Dad, 2 things. Baby girl may not live, or if she does, she may not be normal. So you need to know that. Which, it's interesting when that happens. I didn't care about the back half. I just wanted her to live. So my wife had just gone into major surgery, and I had a baby girl in a little bubble. Many of you have been to ICUs. John, as a nurse, you've seen all this stuff. But there's this itty-bitty baby with electrodes and tubes. There's more electrodes and tubes and wires. And she was under severe stress. And with the heartbeat monitor just flying like this. And what do you do? And the nurse said, Dad, calm her down. Dad. I could reach in, stroke her tummy, and talk to her. She recognized my voice. To the Moreland family, you need to hear God's voice. He's our shepherd. You know why that analogy is there? Is because sheep aren't easily herded. If you got a really good dog, maybe, but you get sheep to follow because they follow that shepherd's voice. The medical professionals tell me, because I don't think I left for other than to I mean, I look really bad and really grungy, but I don't think I left for 3 to 4 days. But he said that was a major impact of why not only did she live, she's perfectly normal, she's doing great. For those of you who wonder why I'm so fervent on the pro-life issue, now you know. Because once again, you live it, life is precious. Maybe that's not the best analogy or not comforting at all to the Morelands, but in those cases, we need to listen to his voice. And I don't want to end it on that, so I'm going to share one last thing, and then I will shut up. I've got a 91-year-old mother who is a prayer warrior. She does Bible studies. She mails them old school. She writes children's books on biblical stories. She is an absolute stalwart, and she has been my biggest supporter my whole life. And when I got elected to Congress, she says, among other things, honey, he said, I do worry because I hate to send you back there with the wolves. And without even thinking about it, I said, Mama, with God's strength, I'm the wolf. And so this may be a really twisted comparison and contrast, but I want to try to do it. I think that there's those personal things and those personal times where we got to take the approach of being the sheep and listening to the shepherd, because we have to have that as our direction. But when somebody attacks, somebody threatens, whether it's your family, your state, your country, you go into the wolf mode. Jesus was not passive. And he sets the ultimate example for us. There are times. And so we need to stand. We need to stand our ground in that regard. I'm going to close my comments by just saying Pastor Paul, I think, set things up really well today. Ultimately, the problems that we're all facing are not going to be answered best by men. It's going to be answered by God and God's direction. And that's what, together, we can bolster one another. And thank you for giving me the honor of talking behind a pulpit, not just a lectern like I'm used to doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.